going to now take a look at foreign affairs. A lot of our focus so far has been on domestic policy. So we're going to look at what was kind of going on internationally, what were the responses to the goings on internationally, and how that really perpetuated throughout the entire cabinet and the administration during this presidency of George Washington. And so there's a couple of things going on. When we look to George Washington's presidency, he easily wins a second term. Excuse me, easily wins a second term. And in doing so, he decides that he's going to focus on foreign policy and foreign affairs instead of domestic policy. The domestic policy was important in the beginning because it was the birth of a new nation, essentially. Now, there are a lot of global conflicts that are going on, particularly between England and France, that are dividing Americans, and it's kind of getting into this idea that maybe we need to get involved in these conflicts and maybe we're going to have to choose a side. All right, now what's going on with England is that they decided they're going to ignore the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Remember, Treaty of Paris in 1783 is the treaty that ultimately ended the American Revolution. But what they disallow essentially is they say that the United States can no longer trade with the West Indies. That the West Indies was controlled by the British, and so they decide they're going to cut off trade there. And so they're not recognizing and really not respecting the United States as a new nation, and that's going to lead to some conflicts. All right. Now George Washington believes that neutrality is probably going to be the best option, meaning not to get involved, just kind of remain neutral, don't take a side, don't pick between England and France. But there are some Americans that are going to get very passionate about this. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson would be one of them. During this time as well, France is in the middle of a French Revolution. There are people in the United States that support the French Revolution, but they're also concerned for a couple of reasons, right? Like, first of all, that might inspire a revolution in the United States, but also they're concerned mainly because they don't want to be seen favoring one side over another in terms of England versus France. Now, keep in mind, the French Revolution was between French people, but if the United States comes to the aid of France, England might interpret that as siding with France and being more sympathetic to France. And so what ends up happening, and I'm not going to go into too many details because you guys covered it in world history, but there is some spillover from the French Revolution that causes conflict between England and France. And so there is some conflict, there is bloody conflict between England and France, and we are going to kind of get caught up in the middle of it. And in a way, because we're kind of the new kids on the block, both sides are going to try to almost bully us to an extent. And this isn't going to be the first time or the only time, but it is important to kind of acknowledge that this is going on. And so there is another disagreement between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson in terms of how do we approach this England and France situation. I'll start with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson believes that England should be punished. Right, that we need to cut off trade with England and we need to favor France. We need to make a very clear statement that we will stand with France. Because France is leading a revolution, or the people, the commoners are leading a revolution, and they need to be rewarded for that. And I have here the word impressment. What impressment means essentially is that they are the British Navy is stopping ships with Americans on those ships, and not just white Americans, but also there might be slaves on those ships. And what they're doing is they're forcing them to board British ships and making them soldiers essentially, right? So they're making them fight for the British, and so that's going to be a problem. Thomas Jefferson believes that England should be punished for that. All right, Hamilton on the other side. He believes that England should not be punished for that, but they should be they should be appeased instead. Whatever it is that England wants, England should get. All right, don't give England too much trouble. Now, Alexander Hamilton is going to receive a lot of criticism because a lot of people suggested at the time, especially, that he was partial to England, that he favored England, and I mean, he's from the British West Indies. That might be part of it. We know that he favors the elitists to begin with, so we know the kind of structure that England has set up. That might play a role. But we see this very significant division between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Now, I told y'all yesterday, Washington tends to side with Alexander Hamilton. And so, what Washington is going to do is he's going to issue the Proclamation of Neutrality. He's going to make it very clear in 1793 that the United States will remain neutral in this conflict. We will not side with England and we will not side with France. Uh, this is essentially what Hamilton wants. Okay, Washington isn't going to do something that Hamilton doesn't want. All right, and so what England wants us to mind our own business and not side with France. So essentially, in proclaiming neutrality and by not doing anything about the impressment, we are essentially giving England what they want. All right. Also, keep in mind that a lot of Americans did favor France because they helped us during the American Revolution. If you think back to the Battle of Saratoga, that was the turning point in the American Revolution that caused France to kind of wake up and say that, you know what, they might actually win this war, so let's go ahead and help them out. Now, there's also this issue, and you'll see him referred to as Citizen Genet. Citizen Genet is a French diplomat. He travels all around America, and a lot of people did favor the French Revolution and wanted to side with France. But the problem was Genet was very upset with Washington's response. He was upset with the kind of slow response as a result of this conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton. And what he goes around and does is he goes around and speaks publicly, and from city to city, town to town, criticizing this idea of neutrality. And so that kind of turned some Americans against supporting France because they didn't like this idea of this guy, Citizen Genet, as he's called, going around and criticizing Washington's policy. And this is just a cartoon of English and French impressment. It's not just the English who will impress our men, but the French will also do the same thing. Jay's Treaty is named after John Jay, and because of this conflict, with the issue with impressment and this war waging between England and France, Jay is going to attempt to get a treaty signed. He is part of Washington's cabinet, and he has some demands from England. So his demands are he wants the British to remove the troops from the western forts in America. So in that western area, a lot of that hasn't been developed, so there are a lot of British soldiers that are still there. He wants them removed. He wants payment for the impressed ships. So any ship that was seized by the British and whose people were seized in order to work for the British or to be soldiers for the British, he wants payment for that. He says that the United States needs to be reimbursed. And he also wants England to accept U.S. neutrality, just pretty much accept that we're not going to take a side in this. Okay? So that's what John Jay wants. That's not what John Jay gets. John Jay gets what's known as Jay's Treaty in 1794, where the British do give up the western forts. They vacate those, probably mainly because it would save them money to vacate the forts. What he also gets is that the United States can trade in the West Indies. Now, I'm not sure if that's even really a big accomplishment, considering the fact that they were supposed to be able to trade in the West Indies anyway. And also, the main thing that he did not get was that this recognition of neutrality. All right, the neutrality will not be recognized by Britain. In addition to this idea that the impressment will continue, England simply does not respect the Americans at all. They're also probably a little salty from, losing the American Revolution, which is why they're beefing with France still, and they're impressing the Americans. Now, the response to Jay's Treaty is not very good. A lot of people think that it's just a weak treaty. And so Jay was hung in effigy throughout the United States. What that means is that there's kind of these replicas of his body that are like hanging from trees and stuff like that. It's just a sign of disrespect. Uh, Congress are split on whether or not they should ratify this treaty. And when I say Congress, I'm talking about the House and the Senate. The Senate went ahead and ratified it. But we have to keep in mind that the treaty did avoid a war with England, and that's very important because the nation is still very young. All right, but America doesn't get what they want and really what they need because it ends up costing them a lot of money because England is not paying for what they've done. Right, they're not paying back the Southerners for the resources that they lost uh, in terms of goods. They're not paying back the soldiers for the slaves that they lost. They're not paying the merchants back for the ships that they lost and stuff like that. And so in 1790, right, so I'm going to give you guys some background of this. Uh, Before 1795, Spain had closed off U.S. access to the Mississippi River. All right, they wanted to make sure that the Americans weren't coming over there, kind of riling people up or taking land and stuff like that. They encouraged Indian attacks on the Americans to kind of keep them on their side of the continent. Now, keep in mind, Spain controls that large piece of land, which is known as Louisiana. Okay, and Spain is going to see Jay's treaty, and they automatically think that that's some kind of alliance that the U.S. has made with England to be against Spain. And so now they're concerned, right? And there needs to be some kind of negotiation to an extent between Spain and the United States, and especially the United States wants to make sure that this is handled appropriately, because if it is not handled appropriately, they have essentially an enemy right there on their continent. Now, Pinckney convinces Spain to kind of hear him out, and the Pinckney's Treaty is signed. The result of Pinckney's Treaty is as follows: Spain is going to reopen up the Mississippi River. All right, so Americans will again have access to the Mississippi River, and that means that they aren't going to face the constant threat of attacks, or at least not at the urging of Spain. There might still be attacks, but Spain won't be encouraging Native Americans to do it. And also, it settles a border dispute between Florida and the United States. At this time, Spain is controlling Florida again, so we're going to see Florida kind of shift hands a couple of times, and Spain is back. It's back to being Spanish Florida, and we make a very clear border distinction between Florida and the United States as a result of Pinckney's Treaty. And so here's a map where you can see just all of the land that the English powers uh, occupied, as well as what the United States looked like in 1796. So down in the southeast there, you can see Florida. You have East Florida and West Florida, and that's controlled by Spain. The southwest you see is all controlled by Spain, and then if you look at that Great Plains area up into the north, the colony of Louisiana is still controlled by Spain. In the far northwest, there's that unclaimed territory. So now we're going to move into America's first political parties. I talked about earlier how the Federalists and Anti-Federalists really represent America's early political parties. What those are going to do is they're going to transition into some more official organizations. So if we go back to Hamilton's financial plan, the conflict between the English and the French, the division that those two things cause really rupture the government, right? Like, it starts off with the Bill of Rights. Then we have this idea that Hamilton wants to create a national bank, known as the Bank of the United States. And then there's the split because England and France are beefing. This leads to America's first political parties. The first one would be the Democratic Republicans. Don't get confused by the name. Like I said in class, the Democrats that we know today did not exist until 1824, and the Republicans that we know today did not exist until the 1850s. So yes, the name sounds familiar. It sounds very common, but they're just kind of going off what those words really mean. It's not representative of today's parties. And so the Democratic Republicans are led by Thomas Jefferson. They are essentially the anti-federalists. So whenever you think Democratic Republicans, just automatically think anti-federalists. They believed in states' rights. They believed in a strict construction. That means a very strict interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. Remember, Thomas Jefferson had said, and Thomas Jefferson and Madison said that Hamilton can't create a bank because it's not listed in the Constitution. They have ties to France. They favor France. They really believe in the French Revolution. They think that we should help out in the French Revolution, and they also very much value liberty. Right. So essentially, what they do is they represent the just kind of the passion and the drive in that fight against tyranny that existed in 1776. Okay, so you'll see them called Democratic Republicans. You might see them called Jeffersonians or Jeffersonian Republicans, or sometimes they'll just be called Republicans. And so just be mindful of that. But a lot of the people that were anti-federalists are going to be Democratic Republicans. Now, the other party would be the Federalists, right? They are led by Alexander Hamilton. And as you know about Hamilton, he does believe in a strong central government or a strong national government. We know that he believes in loose construction because, and when we say loose construction, we're talking about how the Constitution is interpreted. Because, think back to the Bank of the United States. He says, okay, it doesn't say in the Constitution that the bank can be created, but there is something in the Constitution called necessary and proper. And this idea of the elastic clause, that the government can do what they need to do in order to run the country. And that's the loose construction. Right? He has ties to England. He's from the British West Indies. And he really, really values public order. He believes that democracy or pure democracy will lead to anarchy, and that's what he's going to seek to prevent. All right. And so he's just kind of very big on control of many aspects of life, particularly in terms of promoting business, but also making sure that the people are supporting the government. And what he represents is what we would call the spirit of 1787, right? This idea of kind of framing the U.S. Constitution and fighting for a stronger national government. And remember, the conflict that arose that kind of inspired this stronger national government was Shays' Rebellion. And so here you see the difference between the two parties. Sorry, I'm just trying to move this over here. You see the difference between our first two political parties. On the left, you see the Federalists. On the right, you see the Democratic Republicans. You see how they felt about the strength of government. Federalists want a strong government. Democratic Republicans want a limited government. Some of their concerns, right, in terms of the rule of the people. The Federalists fear mob rule, right? They think democracy leads to anarchy, whereas the Democratic Republicans fear rule from the powerful or rule by one person. That's why they don't like this idea of a very strong central government. As far as interpretation of the Constitution, the Federalists believe in the loose construction. They use necessary and proper pretty much whenever they want to. Whereas the Democratic Republicans believe in strict construction. If it's not in the Constitution, it's not legal. The Federalists want the national bank, also known as Bank of the United States, while the Democratic Republicans oppose the national bank. The Federalists, they believe in basing our economy off of manufacturing and shipping. So basically, merchants and business. Whereas the Democratic Republicans favor farming or an agrarian society. And so, as you can see, if you deduce and you analyze these things, ultimately the supporters of the Federalists are people like merchants, lawyers, businessmen, clergy, etc. And the supporters of the Democratic Republicans are primarily farmers, but also a lot of people who have different trades, welding and stuff like that. All right. John Adams was a lawyer. He was a Federalist. Now, let me go to the next slide if it lets me, but it won't. Sorry, guys. I don't know what's going on here. All right, there we go. So, both parties had a very concerted attempt to destroy each other. All right, they had multiple opportunities to slander each other. The Federalists are going to be far more powerful, though, than the Democratic Republicans, and we'll explain why in a bit. But they definitely want to make sure that they are controlling to some extent the media and really influencing the way that the people of the United States see their opposition. All right. During Washington and Adams presidential eras, the Federalists will be very, very dominant. Okay, Adams is going to be a Federalist. Technically, Washington was not a member of either party, but he certainly favored the Federalists because he listened to pretty much anything Alexander Hamilton would say. What's going to kill the Federalists, or at least in terms of elections, would be when Thomas Jefferson is elected. Okay, but they're permanently going to be destroyed around 1814, I believe, and we'll talk about that in our next unit. Now, during this time, a lot of the commoners, the kind of everyday common people, were pretty literate for the most part, and so media is really going to play a huge role in how parties are perceived. Now, you read about the Whiskey Rebellion, and I know I've kind of mentioned it a bit in class. The Whiskey Rebellion takes place in 1794 in Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania. And so, because of the tax that impacted whiskey, it was mainly on wheat, but obviously they need that to make the whiskey. That's an excise tax. All right. And so, that excise tax on whiskey ultimately inspired this Whiskey Rebellion. All right. And what happens is in Pennsylvania, the governor isn't doing anything to respond to this. The governor's kind of terrified that this is even happening. The Federalists start to get concerned because they're afraid of mob rule, and they're worried that there's going to be some kind of takeover of government, and how is the United States going to respond to that? They think everybody's in danger. But what Washington does is he rides in himself and puts down the rebellion. All right. And so what that shows now is that this is a very powerful government. Whereas with Shays' rebellion, remember that's before the U.S. Constitution, the rebellion kind of died out, but there wasn't really a plan for dealing with it. Now we have at least a navy of some extent, or we have a national government that can essentially call up some men to go and suppress a rebellion. And when the Constitution was first created, we didn't have a standing army, but we slowly developed a strong, committed force to respond to instances like this. And so if Washington wanted to lead some men, he would be able to lead some men. And Washington, if I'm not mistaken, I think Washington was the only. No, there were two presidents that were directly involved in combat, and Washington was one of them. And when I say in combat, I'm talking about during their presidency. All right, but the Whiskey Rebellion is something that's used by both parties to attack each other. So think of it like today, all that mudslinging in politics. That's pretty much what's going on with the development of our first political parties. Now, what we see in the Whiskey Rebellion is that the farmers are rioting with the same passion and same fervor as those who rioted, or who responded, I should say, and boycotted as a result of the Stamp Act. Okay, Hamilton sees this as some kind of conspiracy from the Jeffersonians. They think that they're kind of riling these people up. Jefferson saw this as an excuse, essentially, for the Federalists to raise an army and intimidate Republicans, because we didn't have a standing army, but they sure got one really quickly to respond to this conflict, right? And so both sides are using this to kind of tell their story or their narrative to the people and putting their own twist on it. And this is pretty much what I just said. Uh, and again, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was just George Washington and President Madison that were directly involved in combat while they were serving. Madison's combat would have been a little bit later uh, during a conflict that we have with England, and we'll talk about that in our next unit. Washington's farewell address. In 1796, George Washington announced that he was going to retire. All right, so he was not kicked out. He just announced he was going to retire. And in his farewell address, there are two things that you need to know. He says a lot of things, but two things that are very, very important. He warns against political parties. All right, he never joined a party. He was partial to the Federalists. He listened to Alexander Hamilton the most, almost all the time, but he never officially joined a party. But he saw what the parties did to the people. He saw what the parties did to his friends that he had fought for independence with. And so he warns that this could be something that's very dangerous to our country. And he also warns against this idea of entangling alliances. Okay, and that's specifically dealing with foreign nations. He promotes neutrality ultimately. That we need to establish a precedent. We need to establish a tradition of non-intervention. We must take care of America. We are a new nation. We have to make sure that we are okay and we are doing well before we get involved in other people's affairs. A couple more things. Washington never specifically called out the Federalists or the Democratic Republicans. And like I said, he tended to side with Hamilton. And Washington's decision to retire, it sets the tradition for the two-term presidency, but it doesn't make it law, right? That's not going to be made law until more modern times when Franklin Roosevelt dies, and that'll be late 1940s, I believe, when we adopt that amendment. This is just a discussion question. That's something that we'll probably just discuss in class. And this is a table that we're going to go over. We'll probably do this Friday. I'll skip that. We're going to be moving into the Adams presidency. John Adams. So after George Washington serves, John Adams is the next likely candidate, right? Like, he runs for president. He was vice president under George Washington. People like him for the most part. He definitely has some weaknesses, but he has a lot of strengths. Okay, he's the quieter of the cabinet, one of the quietest members of the cabinet. But when he speaks, he's very passionate in his speaking. And so here we have the election of 1796, and you can see how political parties played a role. And you see that now these candidates are identified by party, right? And you see how close this is. If you look at the voting percentage, you have 51% leaning towards Adams and 49% leaning towards Thomas Jefferson. Now, back in this day, I know things are very, very different now, but back in this time, there wasn't really a running mate per se. So whoever won the presidency would become president, but whoever got second place would become the vice president. And that became very problematic, considering the fact that you could be running along with essentially an enemy of yours. And in this case, what ends up happening is you have a president and a vice president from two different political parties. Do notice, though, that Jefferson takes the country, right? He takes the farming area, and Adams picks up the areas that are really big on manufacturing and shipping. Look at those coastal areas for the most part. Adams he's a Federalist, so he's gonna try to continue with Washington's policies. He believes in neutrality. He doesn't want to cause any trouble, but he does face some problems. Jefferson is now his VP, his vice president. He had just ran a very dirty campaign against him. They had been very, very good friends. As a matter of fact, it was John Adams who gave Thomas Jefferson the confidence to start speaking up, and gave him the confidence that he could write something like the Declaration of Independence, and really made him believe in himself. Thomas Jefferson had a stutter, and he had a speech impediment, and so he did struggle for quite a bit, and John Adams was there as kind of this supportive friend. Another problem that Adams had is that most of his cabinet actually took orders from Hamilton instead of him. And Hamilton was not a member of his cabinet. He had decided he was going to go out and leave when Washington left, but he's still kind of pulling the strings in this Federalist Party. And so that kind of undermines uh, John Adams in many ways. There's also going to be a period in which there are tensions with France that emerge, with impressment and things like that. All right. So we have Jefferson as well as the Democratic Republicans constantly attacking Adams' policies. Right. We know who the leader of the Federalist Party is, and that leader is not John Adams, but it is Alexander Hamilton. Now, typically, the person who is the president and they are the leader of their party. Well, in this case, it's not. Like John Adams is simply not respected enough to be seen as the leader of this party. One of the crucial conflicts, and I can't believe I just said crucial conflicts. Y'all are probably too young to remember this, but Crucial Conflict used to be a rap group when I was a kid. Anyway, one of the crucial conflicts of John Adams' presidency was known as the XYZ affair. All right, and so we have this issue with France where our relations with France are declining. We have not been as favorable to France as they think we should have been, especially considering they helped us out in the American Revolution. France interpreted Jay's Treaty as an alliance with England. And so we have all these misinterpretations of Jay's Treaty, but they see it as an alliance with England. And so what they start to do is they start to seize and impress American merchant ships. So they take these merchant ships, ships with goods, slaves, all kinds of stuff, and they take what's on the ships and they impress the men. They make the men serve them. All right. And so what happens is there's an American diplomatic mission that goes to France, and there are 3 French officials that demand bribes. All right. This stands for XYZ, essentially. Now they're demanding bribes. They say, well, if you want to meet our political leaders, then you're gonna have to give us money. You're gonna have to pay up. All right. What ends up happening though is that the diplomats refuse to do this, and so Adams ends up looking really good because we didn't fall into that French trap. And this is just another that image again, understanding that the French are impressing upon American sailors. Remember before we had that issue where it was mainly the English, but now the French are pissed at us because they think we've sided with the English. Another issue during Adams' presidency were the Alien and Sedition Acts, and these acts they're typically kind of noted together, but they were technically different laws. And what they're going to do, the Federalists promote the Alien and Sedition Acts in order to stop the Democratic Republicans from criticizing them. All right. And so the first one, the Alien Enemies Act, what that allows the president to do is pretty much expel any foreigner that they want to. All right. If they see them as an enemy of the state, an enemy of the United States, they can expel them from the country. The Naturalization Act impacted voting. All right. So that said, you must be a United States resident for 14 years in order to gain citizenship and then ultimately vote. Now, the thing is, because the Democratic Republicans tended to represent the common man, a lot of the people who supported them were immigrants, right? And mainly, I mean, obviously, we're still talking about European immigrants, but they get a lot of that support from immigrants. And so if those people, especially that are already in the United States, right, if they have not been a resident of the United States for 14 years, now they just lost political power and political participation. They're not going to be allowed to vote. All right. And finally, you have the Sedition Act. And this is very, very important because what the Sedition Act did is it made it pretty much illegal to criticize the government. Right? So it became a crime to criticize the government, and this is their way of kind of controlling what the Democratic Republicans uh, said about the Federalists, right? And because of the dominance of the Federalists, especially in our federal court system, remember our federal court system was set up. We had the Supreme Court, the U.S. Constitution, but the federal court system was set up by that Judiciary Act. And so because of this conflict, right, uh, in terms of who's trying to kind of vie for political power, this is definitely going to impact how the Federalists are controlling access to information. Okay, and so all of those things come together to create the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what those Alien and Sedition Acts do is effectively they threaten the foreigners, they threaten immigrants, they control uh, what's said about them. Anyone that criticizes the government essentially is going to face consequences. It becomes a criminal act. Now, keep in mind, they wrote that law with the intention of only using it themselves. Right? As a matter of fact, they made sure that the law expired uh, at the end of the presidential term because they wanted to make sure that that law could not be used against them if Thomas Jefferson or a Democratic Republican became president. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. A lot of people in Kentucky and Virginia are Democratic Republicans. They see these Alien and Sedition Acts as a threat to individual liberties and personal freedom. Jefferson and Madison are going to write the Virginia and Kentucky resolves. Jefferson will write Virginia, Madison will write Kentucky. And this is important because what it does is it says that the states can nullify federal laws that they see as unconstitutional. This is so important because this is the first time in America that we've kind of come up with this idea of nullification, and it's going to be this idea of nullification that impacts the United States not too long later, not too long after, when we get into Andrew Jackson, and ultimately a little bit later when we get into the Civil War. And so because these resolves received quite a bit of media, it definitely weakens the Federalist Party, but it does plant the seeds for nullification. And what nullification means is that if a state doesn't like a law, they don't have to follow it. And so there's nothing in the Constitution that says that. It's just an idea, right? It's like if a law is unconstitutional, if they believe the law is unconstitutional, then they don't have to follow it. And so nullification is something that comes up every once in a while as an act of resistance. And ultimately, what the Democratic Republicans are doing, they are resisting the government, which is run by Federalists, and their development of the Alien and Sedition Acts. You don't necessarily need to write this down. As a matter of fact, I don't even think. Basically, yeah, it says don't write. You don't need to write it down. Basically, the only thing that you really need to know from this is that, to an extent, the XYZ affair was in fact resolved. Adams sends another diplomatic mission back, and it improves relations between France and the United States, and that kind of paves the way for us eventually, some years later, to purchase the Louisiana territory. There is some conflict between Alexander Hamilton and John Adams because Hamilton's trying to basically run the country. And so what Adams does is he dismantles the army because he doesn't necessarily think that we need one. The election of 1800. This is also known as the Revolution of 1800. In 1800, the Federalists were incredibly divided because of this rift between Hamilton and John Adams. Hamilton is going to try to undermine John Adams, and what ends up happening is that Jefferson wins the election. There is a tie between Jefferson and the vice presidential candidate, Burr. And so what ends up happening, though, is that we're going to develop another amendment to kind of deal with this and make sure that ties like this never happen. And we'll talk about that more so when we get into our next period. I don't want to confuse you because that's not going to be on the period 3 test. But 1800 is revolutionary for a couple of reasons. For one, it's peaceful, right? It's this peaceful transfer from one political party to another. And as a result of that, we're going to see a different vision for America, right? We go from having this vision that the Federalists have of manufacturers and merchants, and now we're going to have a vision of Thomas Jefferson, the farmer, right? Like promoting the common man and believing in a small government. And it'll be interesting to see how he might change, if he changes at all. Here you see the results of the election of 1800. Jefferson says in his inaugural speech, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." He makes a real attempt of kind of unifying the country. But I mean, just look at the results. You know, the Federalists finish at the bottom. Both of the top candidates are within the same political party, the Democratic Republicans, and so they're not going to necessarily have the same conflict that John Adams had with Thomas Jefferson. Now, eventually, in order to prevent another tie, like we see here on the screen, Congress is going to pass that 12th Amendment so that our president and vice president can be put on separate ballots. And I think that's it for this. We are pretty much done, guys. Pretty sure that is it. All right, guys, it's a wrap. Y'all have a wonderful night. This was long.